Hey. Hello, this is David Wilson for This View of Life, the Evolution magazine. I am delighted to be talking with Adam Grant, the author of Give and Take, a revolutionary approach to success. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I've admired your work for more than a decade now, so I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much, and we've agreed that this is going to be give and take here, so I'm not just talking with you. You can also pose questions to me. And start out by saying I love your book. I hope everyone reads it. And I wanted to begin by having you state the thesis of the book for those that are not yet familiar with it.
Sure. Well, it turns out that there are three basic motives that people bring to their interactions. And I've been studying this in the workplace primarily, but you could certainly take this lens far beyond just professional interactions. And so at two ends of a spectrum, we have the takers and the givers. Takers being people who try to get as much as possible from others and don't like giving anything back unless they absolutely have to. The givers on the other end of the spectrum are not necessarily philanthropists or even volunteers, but rather people who enjoy helping others and frequently do it without any strings attached. Might involve sharing knowledge, making introductions, providing mentoring, giving advice. And then very few of us are pure takers or pure givers, although we probably know some people that we think fall into those categories. I find that the majority of people are matchers, and a matcher is somebody who tries to keep an even balance of give and take. So David, if I were to do you a favor, I would expect an equal one in return, and if you did me a favor, I would feel like I was in debt until I'd been able to settle the score. So the book is basically about these three styles and who sinks to the bottom and who rises to the top, and that might be an interesting point to kick off the conversation. So from an evolutionary standpoint, well, how do the givers, the takers, and the matchers fare?
Right, so a few points to make in preparation. First of all, this is a book primarily for a business audience. Is that right? At least that's how it's pitched.
Definitely, yeah. I wrote it thinking about anybody who's interested in psychology and work and success, and the business audience definitely is first and foremost there.
And you come from a business background. I want you to tell me a little bit about your background, of where you're coming from here.
Sure. So I'm trained as an organizational psychologist, which means most of my research is situated in the workplace, but looking at what are the major drivers of success and well-being on our jobs.
And I'll toot your horn a little bit. Youngest professor at the Wharton School of Business to get tenured. Am I right about that?
I am told that might have been true at some point.
Which is congratulations. That's pretty awesome.
Thank you. I will try to live up to it.
Yeah, and so and of course, from an evolutionary perspective, this is all about the cosmic conflict between cooperative behaviors that cause groups to function well and more self-serving behaviors that cause individuals to benefit at the expense of groups. And of course that underlies all my own work on multi-level selection. Pervades the biological world, everything from the origin of life to the evolution of cancer, not to speak of the behaviors that we automatically think of as social. Plays a key role in the human evolutionary story. Pervades everyday life. In my current work now, I study those differences as they play out in everyday life, and so you're applying this to a business context. And one reason that I got so much out of your book is that you tapped into a literature that I'm unfamiliar with. So I learned a lot in terms of how these ideas are playing themselves out in the world of business. Now, one thing you do well in this book, which makes it an entertaining read, is that you mix stories of people who are givers and takers in their behaviors with some of the scientific literature. And I just wonder if you could just pick somebody that you describe in the book as a taker and as a giver.
Sure. Well, thank you for the feedback. I've always loved reading books that bring evidence and stories together, and so I felt like the least I could do was try to write something that I might want to read as an outsider. On the taker side, I think the obvious example for me would be Frank Lloyd Wright. And I like that example because it illustrates that there are plenty of takers who can and do achieve success. So Wright was obviously a wildly celebrated architect, responsible for some of the greatest architectural innovations, I think, in world history. And if you look at his behavior, one of the things you see is that he was very reluctant to support the people around him and especially below him. I ended up borrowing a phrase that I liked a lot from Dutch, which translates to kissing up, kicking down.
Right.
And I think that's what we see with a lot of takers, right, who are good fakers when they're trying to impress powerful people, but it turns out to be a lot of work to pretend to be helpful and generous with everybody you meet. And so, when you look at the Frank Lloyd Wrights of the world, you see sometimes letting their guard down a little bit, right, when dealing with peers and subordinates. So with Wright, he had a lot of apprentices, and he basically forced them to do slave labor. And he felt like they were, really lucky just to be in the presence of his greatness. And he exploited them so badly that many of his apprentices quit. There was one situation where he actually set a policy that if any of the apprentices on his team were to do any work, they had to sign his name first, or else he would consider it a forgery. And even if he had no involvement in that work whatsoever, of course, that was literally taking a lot of credit. So we look at that story and we think maybe he got away with it, but I would say not so fast.
Right. He billed his own son, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He sent his son John literally an itemized bill for everything that he had cost him over the course of his life. I can't think of a bigger moment of taking in the family than that if you were ever to work with a child of yours. Poor John, as the story was told, was just looking for a reasonable salary. And Frank Lloyd Wright came back and said, I've already spent enough money on you, and here's exactly what you cost me.
And so, one of the things this means is that actually he did not have many protégés. As brilliant as he was as an individual, the people that worked with him did not go on to successful careers for the most part. Am I right about that?
That's right. I think that, when you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's contemporaries, many of them had, just legions of followers who went on to great things. And, I think when givers succeed, generally speaking, you see a rising tide lifting all boats. Whereas it seemed like Frank Lloyd Wright was almost playing a game of Battleship and trying to sink all of the other boats in his sea as he was rising. And I do think that's a prototypical view of a taker's, that in order to succeed, you have to be separate and superior and better than others.
Yeah. Okay, well, give us a story of a giver now.
Well, I think that, the fun story of a giver, of course, would be the giver that I juxtaposed with Frank Lloyd Wright, which would be George Meyer. And I think what's interesting about Wright's story is that he went through a 9-year period where he hardly produced anything, because he had basically believed that he could go out and succeed on his own, and he didn't need other people. And that was one of the lowest points in his career, and he actually became, I think, a little bit less of a taker in his relationships with mentees after that experience. So the sort of counterpoint to that would be George Meyer, who was this comedy writer who, on the face of it, doesn't look like your prototypical giver. He's constantly sort of satirizing and making fun of things that he disrespects. But he managed to become the guy who is described by many as the genius of all geniuses behind The Simpsons. And if you look at his history, George Meyer worked on over 300 Simpsons episodes and gave away many of the jokes that he created, and only took writing credit on 12 of those episodes. And he's one of these people where you might not know his name right away, and yet he was able to create this extraordinary TV show. And when he left The Simpsons, several of the writers immediately said, you've got to come back, because if you're a taker and you've been really successful, then other people are threatened by you. Whereas everybody was rooting for George Meyer because they so respected his willingness to give feedback, to make their jokes better, to give away some of his best ideas. And ultimately that helped him end up writing for the movie, which grossed over $500 million, and he got a total of 7 Emmys for that work.
Yeah. So let's bring in a little bit of science here. And one of the studies you write about that I loved was following a cohort, I think it was of medical students, and showing that the takers did better than the givers at the beginning, but then that was reversed at the end of medical school. Am I right about that? And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, Philip Lievens and his colleagues did a lovely study over 7 years of every medical student in Belgium. And they basically measured, your score on the giving spectrum by surveying you with statements like, I love to help others. And of course, a giver would be more likely to agree with that statement than a taker. And in year one, indeed, there was a negative correlation between your standing on that giving spectrum and your grades in medical school. And in some interviews, there were medical students who said things like, well, you know, when it came time to study for a big exam, if I was a giver, I would actually teach my friends things that I already knew, as opposed to filling the gaps in my own knowledge. And you know, obviously that was self-sacrificing. What was interesting, though, was every subsequent year over the course of medical school, the givers pulled further and further ahead of the takers, even with their objective grades. And by the end of medical school, the positive correlation between giving and grades was stronger than the effect of smoking on the odds of getting lung cancer. And I think the argument that I would make is that, you know, the givers didn't change, but the way that they were evaluated did. Now, you know, in years 3 and 4, you're not being graded on the basis of your individual exam performance. Now you're working with teams of nurses and technicians and fellow would-be physicians, and you're also taking care of patients. And where givers really thrive and succeed, of course, is in interdependent collaborative work, and that's ultimately where they were able to thrive.
Well, I would actually say that something else might have been going on based on some other studies that I know, whereas the whole advantage, this is back to evolution, basically. So how does giving succeed as a Darwinian strategy? It's when givers get to associate with other givers and avoid associating with takers, basically. And at the beginning of school, you don't know who anyone is, and so you're going to get a lot of mixed interactions. It doesn't take too long for people to sort themselves out and for the givers to find the other givers, and in which case they'll do better even in their studies because now they have supportive networks and the takers don't really have access to the givers. And this has been demonstrated, a study I'm familiar with by Ken Sheldon at the University of Missouri, did just that following a cohort of incoming freshmen and documenting that sorting process. So I think that that's, you know, perhaps what's also going on there. And that actually leads to my next question, which is one of the things you show in the book is that in the business world, the givers do the best and the worst. And so a little bit more about that, please. How does some givers manage to succeed despite their giving ways, from being avoid being victimized, and how is it sometimes the case that givers indeed become, I think you call them chumps and doormats?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite aha moments when doing this research, was this sort of polarizing effect that if you were a giver, it was either a recipe for disaster or success, but not much in between. And when you look at basically the givers who are extraordinarily productive and also produce very high quality work and compare them with the ones who are consistently struggling, you find a couple of differences. I think they all sort of boil down to the idea of, are you giving in ways that are completely self-sacrificing? Or are you giving in ways that are basically aligned with, or at least not directly at odds with, your own individual ambitions and goals and interests? So one way this plays out, obviously, is in terms of time. So the givers who fail are the ones who are basically helping all of the people all the time with all the requests, as opposed to setting clear boundaries and saying, look, I have windows of time where I'm trying to push my own work forward, and then I have other windows dedicated to supporting other people. Or saying, look, I'm going to help in ways that are a little bit more win-win, as opposed to directly win-lose and zero-sum. Another way this plays out beyond time, of course, is to your point, who are you helping? So failed givers end up basically sacrificing themselves at the hands of takers and getting exploited frequently. The successful givers are much more likely to say, look, I'm going to sort of do some sincerity screening and invest my giving with matchers who are more likely to pay it back and givers who are more likely to pay it forward, and be a little bit more cautious when dealing with the takers.
Yeah.
So what do we know from your research and expertise? How do you catch a taker? How do you spot somebody? What are the evolutionary cues that you would pick out?
Yeah, so I mean, this just taps into a huge evolutionary literature, and you're familiar with some of it, but at the most basic level, at the game theoretic level, we know that unconditional cooperators and altruists typically do poorly, except under very special conditions. And so altruism needs to be protected. And that can happen in a number of ways. Either sorting, so if you can just find other sweeties, givers find other givers, they actually can be unprotected because of their partner choice, basically. If that's not possible, then you have to have a way to respond to taking behavior by shutting off your own giving behavior. And so all of the tit-for-tat type strategies are what that's all about. But as soon as you get such things as reputation, long histories of interactions, and institutional mechanisms, you can stack the deck in favor of giving. You really can stack the deck. You can make it hard to be a taker. And I mean, one of my favorite examples is just the whole concept of references. Even in the British Navy, if you were a sailor and you were going on a new ship assignment, you had to have a reference from your captain of the previous ship in order to get onto another ship. So taking behavior, exploitative behavior, and especially in a human context, is something which is a very risky thing to do. And so all of this is playing itself out in the workplace. Unsurprisingly, in retrospect, I'm going to get back to that in a minute. I want to address the point of like this three types argument. We should be skeptical about anything that divides people into types, right? And so I mean, typologies are everywhere. So I suspect you're not really saying that there's exactly three types of people. But so how do you add some nuance to this idea that there's givers, takers, and matchers?
Yeah, I love that question, and it was one of the things that was quite difficult to write about in the book, right? Because if you capture all that nuance in every sentence, then it's hard to sort of use the prototypes to contrast the styles and when each one is effective. For me, I think the best work on this topic is work that you're intimately familiar with, Alan Fiske's on relational models. What I love about Fiske's work is that the basic sort of approaches to social interaction that he identifies turn out to be mindsets that we all carry with us. And so the way that I would interpret his work as applied to give and take is to say, look, we all have moments or roles or relationships where we think more like a giver, more like a taker, more like a matcher. And I would probably make the case, if you look at the data, that we sort of organize these motives into a hierarchy in any given relationship. Where, for example, if I were approached by a competitor who wanted me to share some proprietary knowledge, I would probably by default think more like a matcher in that situation and say, look, I'm going to share with you, but only if there's some kind of fair and even return. And then I would have a series of more or less heuristics for deciding, okay, at what point is this a safe relationship where I can think more like a giver and share without that expected reciprocity? And also, what kinds of violations would occur that would shift me more into a taking mindset? And so I think we have these sort of rules or principles in mind in all of our interactions. And most of us, and I think what I was trying to get at in the book, most of us have a default that we associate with how do we treat most of the people most of the time. And especially in the workplace, what I find is most people do kind of start with matching as the default. And then as a relationship changes or a role changes, they may shift toward a little bit more of giving and taking. So how does that look from your viewpoint?
Well, there's so much to say. So, and there's kind of an all of the above phenomenon. Are there likely to be genetic differences? Yes. Are there likely to be early environmental effects? Yes. Do we remain phenotypically plastic as adults? Yes. So we're all very. And is there an influence of ideology? So as to the way we think, making some things appear reasonable or not? Yes, yes, yes. And I'm about to get to that as our final point. And so, in some sense, we're all capable of doing these things, and we do. But it's also the case, I think, that that there's big temperamental differences, and that when you do give a survey, which is as simple as asking a question, how important is it to help people in the community? In the first place, there's big individual differences. Some people say, "Oh yeah," and other people say, right? And that response is meaningful in terms of how they behave in everyday life. And we've validated this just as much as anyone could ask in an everyday context, basically giving this kind of survey to public school students and then looking at the consequences, causes, consequences, and validating it with other methods. So at the end of the day, there is a spectrum of individual differences which crudely can be described as a giving-taking continuum. And yes, people can move on that continuum. You weren't born that way, or at least most of us weren't born that way. And so there's just so much information, including biochemical information, in terms of the whole physiology of this and the neurobiology of this is what can be brought to bear on it. Well, I wanted to end with, for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of this, which is that there's something about the subtitle of your book is A Revolutionary Approach to Success. And, you might think, oh, isn't that just hype? And I'm here to say it's not. It actually is revolutionary against the background of the business ethos, which more or less says that being nice is fine in everyday life, but when it comes time to playing business hardball, actually niceness is not a good strategy. And it's that which makes the message of your book so surprising, I think, for a business audience. Tell me if I'm wrong, and elaborate on that theme that the idea of just being nice and just giving stuff away somehow runs against the grain of the ethos of business and economics.
I think it runs against many grains, especially here in the West. Dale Miller's work on the norm of self-interest has made this point very eloquently, and what Miller shows is basically, even in situations where people feel empathy or compassion and want to give and help, they often feel like they have to justify it as self-interested in order to sort of not violate the strong cultural ethos that says, sort of looking out for number one is the way to go. And I think nowhere is that more true than in the workplace. For years, I've had, sort of legions of Wharton students stop by office hours for career advice. And one of the conversations that comes up most frequently is a variation of, okay, I really want to help others and make a difference. So I'm going to be as selfish as possible and maximize my wealth for the next 35 years, and then I can start giving back. And you hear that sort of story and narrative enough, and you start to think, well, what if that's backward? What if some of the most successful people we know didn't succeed first and then start giving back, but actually gave first, and that was one of the reasons they succeeded later? And my hope is that will become much less surprising and revolutionary as people become more familiar with the wonderful work that you've done, and that I think the broader story that social science has been telling about why it can be advantageous in the long run to help others.
Yeah, so this really is a paradigm shift at an elementary level. So on the one hand, it's a paradigm shift, it's a different way of thinking, but on the other hand, it's one that anyone can wrap their heads around. It's not like learning the theory of relativity or anything like that. The point is that the business world is no different in this respect than the rest of life. And actually, human life is no different than the rest of biological life. And in all cases, doing something as a group requires activities that are, in essence, giving activities. And they're vulnerable to exploitation by various forms of taking activities. And the idea that you can do this in a way that monetizes everything at an individual level, so that the only motive is a monetary individual self-interest component, is completely impoverished. And it's not making use of our entire psychology, which is actually set up for giving and protecting ourselves from being taken at the institutional level in addition to the psychological level. And so this is very simple, but it's also paradigmatically different. So I'm here to say that the subtitle of your book is not hype.
Well, thank you, David. And I think in a way, coming full circle to one of your early points, you talked about special conditions where giving is less risky and where people can succeed sustainably by helping others. And I would make the point that in organizations at work, those conditions are not so special anymore. They've become commonplace, right? Clear reputations that follow you from one organization to another or on social media, thinking about repeated interaction, the growing levels of interdependence that we have, and the idea of institutional conditions. The fact that most people are organized into teams and collaborating, I think, means that actually there are rewards coming to the giver that we might not have seen in prior decades.
Yeah, well, let's a little bit more on that, because I've been starting to seriously study business myself and learning this literature. And what I'm discovering is that there are cooperative business models, plenty of them actually, There's businesses that try to be socially responsible, and you could evaluate their bottom lines, not just whether they're succeeding at their social goals, but whether they're actually succeeding as businesses, their profitability. And the data indicates, as far as I can tell, is actually they do. So employee-owned businesses, it turns out, actually do very well, and especially during hard economic times. B Corp corporations actually do very well compared to a matched sample of other corporations. So once again, it's paradoxical that these cooperative business organizations and organizations that do make use of these mechanisms actually do work. The numbers are there to prove it. And once again, nevertheless, they seem weird because of the background ethos, basically. It makes them seem weird. It's the theory that makes all of this seem invisible and unusual. So a change that illustrates the importance of changing the theoretical perspective, basically exchanging one lens for another. And as soon as you do that, all of a sudden, oh, I get it. We need to cooperate and reinforce cooperation, and actually giving can work from day one. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait to make a pile before you can start giving. So it's so simple, and of course makes me passionate about it, as you can see, and I think also makes you passionate about it.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been great, and very looking forward to sharing it on this view of life, and also blogging a little about it with John Hayden, our Forbes.com blog. So look forward to interacting with you more on this topic.
As do I, David. Thank you. And if there are references or studies from the organizational psych world that I can share, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, Doug. Thanks a lot.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.